Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile, and Happy New Year to you. I'm Ayola Kasim. Sweltering weather, variable rainfall, rise in sea level and flooding, droughts and desertification, as well as land degradation are all the signs of our changing climate here in Nigeria. These changes are impacting agriculture and food security, depleting resources in every part of the country and posing a serious food security challenge in face of a rapidly growing population. Low crop yield, food shortages, reduced livestock production, loss of income, and growing desperation over food supply are driving resource conflict across the country. But we are told we can change all these and make things better, from our households to the federal government level. For our first episode of Earthfile this year, we look at where we currently are in the country and the efforts being made to rein in climate impacts. Just stay with us.
Nigeria is experiencing the worst flooding in at least a decade. The floods have damaged homes, infrastructure, and large areas of farmland across the country. With more than 3 million people affected, some of them lost their lives, while many of them have been displaced from their communities. On the other hand, severe droughts, desert encroachment in 12 northern states is causing loss of biodiversity and conflict due to scramble for shrinking agricultural and grazing lands. This is a threat to the livelihoods of over 40 million people, whose livelihoods are endangered by climate change. Across the country, people are seeing either too much or too little rain. The Atlantic Ocean is eating into the country's coast in the south. The sea has even swallowed entire streets in Lagos, the country's bustling commercial capital. While the surface area of Lake Chad continues to shrink, robbing fishers of their livelihood.
Those livelihoods were affected basically by climate change, which now impacted on the basin to cause the Boko Haram insurgency. You know, we had the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast for over how many years, and that actually affected the livelihoods of people. So many people were displaced from their houses. Some of them migrated. We have been able to track some of them and put them in IDP camps. Others we have not been able to trace.
Many stakeholders in the environment space ask governments to do better. They have proposed multiple climate action alternatives to effectively respond to the impact of climate change.
So for us, climate change is critical. All the conflicts that we have in the country, and of course, we look at it from the climate-induced perspective. Yes, we know that there are some political aspects that comes in, but climate change is playing a critical role that needs everybody's attention. How do we mitigate? How do we adapt it? I know that we've been talking about adaptation, but we also need to look at ways of how we can mitigate this. For instance, the forced migration. How does this impact on the communities? How does this impact on the gender, especially the women and children? How do they adapt when there's crisis? Like, for instance, last year, flooding occurred. How were they able to cope? How were they able to adapt to these situations? And how can this be a channel where both government, civil society, and the media will work with us to also amplify these issues? For us, these are some of the things that WEP is looking at from a holistic perspective, working in such a way that we carry everybody along in the context of the SDGs, leaving no one behind. So we are not just targeting women, but we are targeting also the elderly and the people with disabilities. In fact, in the context of where we are working, we discovered that the people with disability are mostly neglected. In fact, nobody thinks that they even exist in terms of fragile and conflict context. Whatever plan that is being done, they are not even brought into perspective at all. So for us, those are critical things. But we are working with them, not a top-down approach, we are working with them from bottom-up approach. They need to tell us what are their priorities, how can they be able to address those issues. And we try to tell them to rank them And when they rank them, we ask them, yes, they are they're disabled, they have the disabilities, but that does not mean that they cannot do certain things. What can you do for us to help you? And it is in this context that WEP is working with the different communities in Nigeria to make sure that we address the issues of climate change from the fragile context, but also looking at it from the gender perspective, because when we talk about gender, we're not just referring to women, but we are more inclined to women because climate change, the way it affects women, it affects the other sex differently. So we're focused. For instance, the issues of mental health. When conflict takes place as a result of climate change and your husband is being killed, your children are being killed, you see that flood has washed away your farm, has washed away your whole household, your source of income, your livelihood is completely washed away. How do you begin to comprehend all these things? So we are looking at also their mental health. How can we address this issue? And those are the issues that most of the time even climate activists don't look into. For us, we are working from a holistic perspective to make sure that we address this issue.
The energy sector, deforestation, and land use change are the greatest contributors to Nigeria's greenhouse gas emissions. On its part, the country has some plans on the way forward. In 2021, the federal government updated its Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDCs, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Paris Agreement, which establishes an unconditional contribution target of reducing greenhouse gas emission by 20% below the business-as-usual emissions scenario by 2030, and a conditional target of 47% greenhouse gas emission reduction below 2018 emissions levels contingent on international support. The 2021 NDC's update includes emissions reduction from the waste sector for the first time. It covers the water resources sector and articulates other nature-based solutions. The National Council on Climate Change, established in 2021 by the Nigerian Climate Change Act, works to mainstream climate change actions and achieve low greenhouse gas emissions objectives. Nigeria's National Adaptation Plan Framework 2020 articulates Nigeria's adaptation objectives, principles that guide these adaptation actions, and facilitates the implementation of priority adaptation activities. The Nigeria Energy Transition Plan outlines Nigeria's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060 across 5 key sectors, which are power, cooking, oil and gas, transport, and industry.
And our president, on May 29th, when he was sworn in, took that strategic decision, bitter to many people and misunderstood by many, of removing subsidy from petrol. Within 2 months, we realized that our consumption of petrol has reduced by nothing less than 35%. When we did the desktop calculation, we realized that on an annual basis, we are saving nothing less than 15 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. If you put that against a profile, an annual profile of 82 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, that is almost in the range of 15 to 16% with just that singular action. So when you look at that and you look at what we are doing with renewable energy, if you look at what we are going to do with methane abatement and ending gas flaring, when you see that with the announcement that Mr. President made about the release or the rollout of 100 electric vehicles and ramping up that number to meet the target of about 7,000 within just in the short term, we will even exceed that target by 2030. But we said to do this, we would need the necessary finance and the necessary technical and technological support. This is not coming. Over 13, 14 years ago in Copenhagen, 2009, the pledge of 100 billion is still being discussed today. how much of it has come. So we do not emit. About 20 countries are responsible for more than 80% of all the emissions that is responsible for global warming. And how much effort are they putting? Even with this issue of transition to cleaner oil, they are busy still giving licenses for new oil drillings. And so, sincerely, I think there is a need for us to be fair. There should be fairness, there should be equity. Whatever you are doing, as we say in Nigeria, you should do it with a human face.
Hearing no objections, it is so decided.
At COP28 held in 2023 in Dubai, Nigeria, like many developing countries impacted by climate change, asked developed countries to do more in terms of financing to help with mitigation and adaptation efforts.
The desert is encroaching from the northern part of the country. There is loss of water, loss of biodiversity, loss of moisture. Farming activities are becoming very difficult. On the other hand, also the livestock population is reducing because they have all left the basin for lack of fodder and water. So they move inwards into the country, and you know what has been happening. The farmers and those herders, a lot of clashes, again causing insecurity. So we are hoping that by coming here, we can get the support of the international community to be able to go back and see what projects they can bring to the basin to restore those livelihoods and to improve the water flows, to retain the moisture that we have now in the basin. Otherwise, we're going to lose it in the next 20 years. We might lose it, and God knows what is going to happen. We don't want another Boko Haram second phase to come because of this, and that's why we are here. We are appealing to everybody through the National Council on Climate Change and the Nigerian government, so that they can look at it and showcase it to the world. Now, this is one basin, if there is any in the country that qualifies for loss and damage funds, it is that basin. We didn't partake in the causing of emissions. There's nothing in that basin. So, but those emissions have caused the climate change that is causing all this havoc in our basin. So we are hoping that, yes, the international community will listen to us through the Nigerian government and bring in remedial projects that will be able to address most of the issues that are now there.
Since Climate Change Act was signed into law by the former president shortly before he left, this is the first time when the president of the country came as the chairman of the National Council of Climate Change, bringing all the ministers' aides together who are directly affected by, policies on climate change in terms of the ministries and agencies that they are superintending over. And one thing that is very important, significant, and must be mentioned, is that Mr. President, in his speech to the National Assembly of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, in paragraphs 23, 24, 25, said that he has directed his aides to diligently work within this COP28 to ensure that they bring in partnerships and funding commitments to the country in line with our national development policy. And he did not stop there. As a president who sets the pace and tone of how he wants to run his administration, he was personally and physically present, attending almost all the meetings. And I was lucky, I was opportune to be in about 4 meetings that he attended, including when he went to the Nigerian pavilion. So in terms of asserting our presence for positive gains, that has been done comprehensively and successfully by the Nigerian delegation.
The government at the conference said Nigeria needs at least $17.7 billion annually to fulfill its NDC unconditional pledges. Similar to his predecessor, President Bola Tinubu has given mixed messages on energy priorities. While he has acknowledged the need to reduce reliance on the oil and gas sector, he has also expressed support for increased oil and gas production for domestic consumption and export.
Allow me, please, to declare the meeting adjourned.
A deal struck at the COP28 Climate Summit in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, to transition away from fossil fuels received a less than hearty welcome from the Nigerian delegates as the country depends on crude oil sales for most of its budget.
Africa has always been paying the greatest price. We pay the greatest price of slavery. We pay the greatest price of colonialism. And now we're paying the greatest price of climate change, what somebody called carbon colonization. So Africa is paying greatest price. Like I said in my statement, some of the outcomes of this COP can become suffocating. And I describe it somewhere, it's like asking Africa to stop breathing without providing life support, which means we want Africa to die. So the developed world must provide life support in terms of investments, in terms of funding, in terms of technology transfers, in terms of capacity building. That is the only way we will not suffocate and die in Africa. Of course, for us as a country too, we must, from this COP, redouble our efforts. Our climate action must be scaled up. Our obligations, we must meet them, and our targets must be targets to be achieved. And I think that already President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has prioritized agriculture, has prioritized mining as alternative sources of funding our economy. So the outcome of this COP is just to challenge us further to follow more diligently those paths that the President has laid out for the country.
The United Nations COP28 summit closed with the signing of a deal to transition away from oil, gas and coal in what the text called a just, orderly and equitable manner in hopes of reducing carbon emissions and ease global warming. It is the first such agreement to move away from fossil fuels since the annual conference began nearly 3 decades ago. The deal also seeks to triple renewable energy capacity globally by 2030 and promotes carbon capture technologies that can clean up hard-to-decarbonize industries. Critics argue that decarbonizing technology is expensive and a diversionary tactic by countries so that they can continue to produce fossil fuels.
These technologies don't work. So whatever has been piloted, the past 30 years of carbon capture and storage, 80% of them have failed. Even if they work, even if a lot of investment goes into carbon capture and storage technology, it means 1% of the fossil fuel emissions will be captured, just 1%. And what we're saying is we need to see a full phase out of fossil fuels in line with 1.5.
Oil accounts for 95% of Nigeria's foreign exchange earnings. Many, including the Nigerian president, have criticized the developed nations for failing to honor a pledge to give $100 billion to poorer countries to mitigate the effect of climate change.
COP28 began with 2 encouraging steps: agreement to operationalize the Loss and Damage Fund and replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. It is a start, but much more is needed. Many developing countries are drowning in debt, have no fiscal space, and are churning in climate chaos. We need all commitments made by developed countries on finance and adaptation to be met fully and transparently. And we need increased capital and reform of the business model of multilateral development banks to massively increase direct support and leverage far more private finance at reasonable cost for developing countries' climate action efforts. And we need far more adaptation ambition.
All we are saying is any country wanting to partner with Nigeria, we are interested in decarbonizing our energy system. We are interested in decarbonizing our oil system. and make it greener, cleaner. So to say that you cannot, that you need to do away with fossil fuel is not stating the obvious. And this text clearly says transition away from these high carbon content fossil fuels and move towards greener, cleaner fossil fuel. And that's already is contained in our energy transition plan. So for us, it's just stating what we have already agreed to do. We have agreed to, remember, as an oil producing country, one of the major sources of the carbon from our oil system is the emission from methane. And our energy transition plan, as well as the Petroleum Industry Act, clearly states that we are going to phase out completely the burning or gas flaring that we know is responsible for burning all the methane by 2030, which is just 7 years from now. So, sincerely speaking, people should just try to understand the implications and the impact.
The country has one of the least reliable electricity grids, and Nigerians spend billions per year on generators. As with most African countries, the Climate Action Tracker's fair share rating means Nigeria will need considerable international support to decarbonize its economy.
Climate change action involves winners and losers, and this is not often well understood by commentators. For every action, there may be people who will lose and people who will benefit. The transition, for example, away from fossil fuel to green energy could result in some people that have had power in the fossil fuel industry losing power and new emergent incumbents having power. Some nations are still struggling to understand the way in which they can act on climate change and still keep a competitive edge. And this is the challenge that we face in making more rapid progress. And so what we need to do is continue to argue to show how we can combine climate action and the pursuit of, the good life, development, economic growth, but also to argue that, growth is not everything. Profit is not everything. And sometimes we need to put, Mother Earth, humanity, morality, justice, equity first. And it is working, but it's not working as fast. So we need to continue to press the argument and double down the diplomacy and hope that we can get more traction and more progress.
In August 2022, to boost its net zero target, Nigeria launched the Emissions Trading Scheme, and in November joined 6 other African countries to inaugurate the new African Carbon Markets Initiative at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Egypt. In its latest report titled Climate Change and Socio-Economic Development in Nigeria, the think tank Agora Policy says Nigeria may lose up to $460 billion due to climate change by 2050 if urgent actions are not taken to curb its adverse effect. It also showed that Nigeria had lost $100 billion to climate change by 2020. The authors of the report believe that 25 million Nigerians are at risk of flooding, and 630 square kilometers of land is susceptible to flooding along the Niger-Benue Basin in the Niger Delta area, while 357,000 people living in Lagos are exposed to flood, and by 2050, 3.2 million Lagosians are projected to be exposed to floods. The direct estimate of loss and damage of flooding in 2022 is put at 1.48 trillion naira, while the total damage and loss, including indirect ones due to flooding, is said to be about 2.6 trillion naira.
One of the biggest challenges with creating awareness for the consequences of climate change is that many people think that the adverse effects are only in faraway countries, not directly touching our lives here in Nigeria. But we are more impacted than we can imagine. So as we say hello to 2024, I hope you have enough resources to ditch dirty fuel, enough backup to stay in the light, and above all, May the climate be more favorable to you in all seasons. From me, Ayola Kasim, and the Earthfile crew here in Lagos, it's bye for now.